week on Shoring Up, we've got a show that comes from 2012 and was a big deal when it first came out. And I am, of course, talking about Made in Abyss. This show, as far as I understand, was highly anticipated. Fans of the manga were very, very eager to see it adapted. And from what I can tell, most people are actually very happy with how the show came out as an adaptation. And I've definitely got a lot to say about this show. So let's jump right into it. Everything about this show, each individual element of its construction is great. The music, for me, is what stood out the most. It's just really selling you on either the tone or the setting or the world-building elements that were being created. Every piece of music seems like almost custom-built for whatever it is played on top of. It is excellent, and it has an almost ethereal quality to it that I really think helps give it a very solid through line for the thematic the thematic goals of Made in Abyss. It's great, but I mean, even then, even outside of the music, you've got the character art, which is very distinctive, very noticeable. It is it's not something that you would mistake for anything else. There's a certain softness that the main characters have in terms of how they're designed. You've got the background art, which at the time the show came out was receiving a lot of praise for looking a whole lot like a Ghibli film in terms of just the level of detail and the beauty with which it was constructed. And I'm personally inclined to agree that the background art definitely does look like it is on that level of quality. And then you've also got the directing, which is excellent. The understanding of where to put the camera, whether it be on the characters super focused in or on the amazing environments that they're going to be exploring. It's just excellent, and every individual aspect is beautiful. But here's where we come to the problem. Because while each and every one of these elements is great in its own right, each one really doesn't work with any of the others. It feels to me like Made in Abyss was made in a way where you had a bunch of people that are brought together who all have an incredible amount of talent in their specific field in the arts. They were then handed the original source material, the manga, and said, hey, we're going to make an adaptation of this show, and we want you to be in charge of this particular aspect. You know, we want you to interpret Made in Abyss through your field of expertise. And they each individually went off and, with no consultation with one another at all, created their piece. They brought it back, and then it was like, well, here we go. Here's our show. We're just going to throw all of these elements together, and now we have our show. There is absolutely, well, it's not entirely devoid of cohesion, obviously, because the show does function. There would have to be some level of it. And I'm not implying that this is how the show is made. Obviously, that's not the case. But that is a lot of what it exudes. The qualities of each element are so strong, but they just don't come together very well for me at all. Like, each one I feel like I need to appreciate by itself, without all of the other ones around crowding out the space and trying to take my attention away. It's a very strange feeling to really admire each individual element of this show's construction, but not really be able to appreciate. It's not that I don't appreciate, but have a much more difficult time of really putting them all together in my mind and appreciating that finished collective product. And it's not to say that this show outside of these elements is perfect either. It does have its own set of problems outside of this. The biggest one being its pacing issues. The show has a lot of pacing issues. Particularly of note was that, in the beginning at least, the show really does feel like it drags its feet. I can remember 2 episodes off the top of my head where it felt like nothing really happened. That the characters didn't get anywhere new on their journey. They didn't grow as people. Nothing about the world was revealed. There's just far too many instances of that kind of thing happening in this show, where the central conceit is the exploration, is the learning about this place that they are in, and along the way, you know, they themselves growing as people. And for it to just not have any of those elements in certain episodes just completely kills it in terms of its momentum. It just completely dies on the side of the road. And all that you want to do is for the show to move on and for you to continue to get that exploration that you had been getting up until that point. And for it to do it, consistently enough that I noticed it multiple times is just, it's a real damper on the show, I think. And I want to be able to enjoy the show in its entirety. And obviously I've already talked about how that is difficult because of each element not really being cohesive with itself. But then you layer on top of that the show is kind of slow in several spots, to the point that it almost feels like the show completely grinds to a halt. I could understand why somebody might have dropped it, like, quite honestly. Like, everything about the show individually was enough to keep me watching, but I can definitely see why somebody would see one of those episodes and see literally nothing happening and just being like, it's not worth it. It's not worth my time. And going off of that same point, as far as the pacing is concerned, the show doesn't actually develop any sort of real character pathos until the very end. Like, I really didn't care about Reg and Rico at all until we finally got to the episode where Reg tries to, cut her arm off, is like forced to start to take that level of very intense action to save Rico's life. Like, and you can argue that it was necessary to take this much time to get to a point where that actually has meaning and impact, but I don't think it needed to take nearly as long as it did. I don't think you needed 10, maybe 11 whole episodes of trying to get to that point. I think that the world itself was so heavily established as being very dangerous, very aggressive, and very outwardly anti-human, that you could have had that happen much earlier on, and I think it would have had the same level of impact. And on top of that, had it happened earlier, the bond that Reg and Rico have would have been strengthened to a point where it would have been much more interesting seeing them going forward together with that kind of connection. On top of this, Nanachi isn't introduced until the very end of the show, and her backstory is something that immediately has tons of pathos. It's built entirely on character pathos, and to not really get that until the very end, when basically, well, we're not going to see Nanachi anymore until the second season, but here you go, care about this character that you just basically don't get to experience anymore. It feels almost short-sighted to develop that level of character pathos and then to just end, to not do anything with it narratively. It seems a huge lost opportunity in my opinion. I think a lot of these pacing problems really would have been solved by, you have the very beginning of the show be like an hour and a half OVA, and then you pick up at the end of where that OVA left off, and then now you've got the rest of the actual show to use all of the character pathos that you've established in that 1 hour and a half block to its fullest extent. And as far as I understand, the Made in Abyss movie that's going to be coming out is going to be taking this route. It seems that they probably have learned their lesson. I have talked to people who I know who have read the manga and who are assuming that the movie is going to cover a certain arc, and they are kind of, based on their predictions, it makes perfect sense why they're taking that route as opposed to just running the show into that arc, like normal. So again, it seems like they've learned their lesson with that particular element of the show's writing and the show's pacing, but it still is kind of disappointing from the perspective of somebody who wanted to care about these characters, who wanted to get invested in their narrative, but wasn't really given an opportunity until the very end, and then the show doesn't really do anything with that connection that it has subsequently built. So now I want to get into one particular element of criticism that I don't have for the show, but that I have 100% heard multiple people level against it, and that is that Made in Abyss is torture porn and lolicon bait. Absolutely not. Under absolutely no circumstances is it either of those things. I don't understand really how anybody can come to that kind of conclusion. So to really jump right into both of these complaints, we'll tackle the whole idea of the show being lolicon bait first. The thing about this entire assumption and why I don't think it is really valid is, well, the idea is that people, I think, have this complaint more or less because the show has a lot of nudity in it, and has more nudity in it than is typical for most TV anime. And also there's a lot of crass jokes made about the nether regions of several of the characters. And the reason that I don't really think that this is applicable as a basis for the idea of the show being lolicon bait is that the show treats nudity with such a laissez-faire attitude that it really taps into the idea of these characters being children, that they don't have the worldliness that you, the audience, do to understand the air quotes, or I don't even have to air quotes this, the gravity of being naked. I mean, and that applies even outside the unique circumstances under which they were raised in the city of Orth. Like, that definitely is a contributing factor, but to try to defend this idea as an analytical point using the show's own justifications doesn't really get you out round of the criticism in general. I don't think that you should, at least when you're trying to level this kind of criticism, you can't really defend it with the show's own justifications, because if it is in fact lolicon bait, then of course the show is going to at least try to have a justification for doing so. But again, because they are children, they don't have this conception of nudity as being this thing that we as adults or young adults tend to have. They don't have the worldliness to appreciate the gravity of what it is that they are going through or exposing themselves in that way. So I just don't think that you can consider it lolicon bait because the show itself does not treat it with that kind of a thematic approach. It's just an asinine opinion to hold, and it's just, I think, reaching for straws in ways to criticize the show when, I mean, I think I've proved here that there's plenty of things that you can talk about as being negatives about the show. And the other thing is that, oh, well, the show is torture porn. Okay, for you to make this argument, you basically, in my opinion, have just obviously not seen enough violent anime. The number of shows that have violence that not only equals but then eclipses what you see in Made in Abyss, and is way more consistent with how much of it there even is throughout the show's run, it's just mind-boggling. There are tons of shows that do far worse than this. And I know that there are people that are going to say, well, it gets, even more, screwed up in the manga. That it's, it gets even darker and blah, blah, blah. We're not here to talk about the manga. We're not. We're talking about Made in Abyss, the show, and how the show is presenting the violence and the brutality of these situations. They are no worse, and in many cases not nearly as bad as some of the violence in shows that I have seen. And then there's the the idea that, oh well, it's different because it's children. No, it's not. Emotionally maybe, but to argue that Made in Abyss is torture porn because it has very grotesque violence completely, in my opinion, it completely ignores the fact that there are tons of shows out there that do far worse. Like, we can point to one of the most popular, most dominant shows in terms of its its cultural impact, Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. The violence and the gore in that show is leagues, miles and miles outside of anything that Made in Abyss ever does. I don't understand how anybody could hold this opinion if you have actually seen any other show that has violence in it. I want to cap this off by saying that despite all of the criticisms that I have leveled against Made in Abyss, that I did in fact have an overall positive experience with this show. I enjoyed the time that I spent with it. The problem that I have with it, and the reason that I was able to level so many criticisms at it, and the reason that those things stood out to me as being things worth talking about, is that it did not stick with me in any sort of emotional way. I didn't get attached to the characters or to the show itself. At least not in the same way that it seems that the larger otaku collective seems to have been. This is not to say that it is a bad show. It engaged me plenty fine. I enjoyed going through and watching every episode. It just didn't leave that lasting impact that I had anticipated based on the reaction that people had originally had when it was first coming out. So I just want to stress that no matter what score I give, and that no matter what complaints I level at Made in Abyss, that it is a good show, that it is worth watching, and that your mileage may vary as far as like how much these problems that I have brought up actually are problems for you. Like I said, it just was not very emotionally resonant to me personally. With that said, I give Made in Abyss a 6, and I'll catch you on the flip side.